Hello and welcome. I'm so happy that you have joined me here today. Today we are looking at Nehemiah chapter 5, so grab yourself a cuppa and we'll get started. So please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the algorithm get out to more people. So Nehemiah chapter 5 verse 1. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous, and in order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." And others were saying, "We have mortgaged our fields and our vineyards and our homes to get grain during the famine." So what happened to this confident operation of rebuilding the walls that we see in Nehemiah chapter 4? All the people were working together to build the city and complete the walls, but there's no mention of this building project now. Instead, we see some strife within the ranks of God's people. So the workers stopped and there's strife amongst God's people. The enemy couldn't stop the work that God was doing to rebuild these walls, but the work stopped when the people became disunified and when they weren't working together anymore. And the reason for this strife among God's people, it was money problems. Nehemiah's money problems was a little bit unusual, maybe not what you expected, but the money problems, that wasn't about managing the building project. There were certainly enough resources to rebuild the walls, but this was a lack of funds because of the people in Jerusalem. They did not have enough money to pay taxes and to buy grain. So due to the situation of people working so heavily on the walls, they weren't able to sort of plant harvests as much or to bring the harvest in. So grain may have been really scarce. And so the poorer people of Jerusalem were forced to mortgage their fields and their vineyards and their homes so they could buy grain and pay the taxes. Verse 4. Still others were saying, "We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and although our children are just as good as theirs, yet we have subjected our sons and daughters to slavery. And some of our daughters have already been enslaved, and we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others." So the current situation hit the poorest people the hardest. And even though, as human beings, they were just as valuable as their richer citizens. The citizens of Jerusalem were complaining because it had gotten so bad that the people were borrowing money off each other. So the poorer people were borrowing money off the richer people to pay the taxes. And some even had to sell their children into slavery to pay those taxes. So these taxes were really Persian taxes. Persia expected revenue from all her provinces. So we can see that in Ezra 4 verse 13. And we know that these tax wasn't paid to an Israelite king because Israel had no king during this time. So the king that the Jews had to pay taxes to was the Persian king, King Artaxerxes. Now there's four main complaints that the people of Israel were making to Nehemiah. They were the physical needs of a large population during famine. Another complaint was that they mortgaged their property for food. The third complaint was they had to borrow money to pay the Persian king's taxes. And the fourth issue was that their daughters were sold into slavery. So neither of these four issues are actually illegal at that time. And they were actually, in fact, legal. And they were allowed to have large families. They were allowed to mortgage and borrow up to 6 years. They were allowed to be sold as slaves, but only, again, up to 6 years. And the people here, there was abuse within what was legal. So they went beyond the intent of the law, which was intended to protect the vulnerable. But here they were taking advantage of the vulnerable. So let's sort of understand a little bit of the Jewish law at that time. Now, since all the inhabitants of Jerusalem were reunited, recruited to build the walls, this ceased their usual practices of labour. So their farming, their agricultural, and their just normal commerce. So people had money problems because they had to work hard on the walls and they couldn't spend as much time on providing for the needs of their household. So people had money problems because there was a famine, because people didn't have the time to plant and to harvest the crops when they were rebuilding the wall, which it made food more expensive because it was more scarce. And so because it was expensive, the people had to mortgage their property to provide money to get the food. And as a result, the people became poorer and they had to borrow money. So Nehemiah had had to solve this problem of predatory lending, or the economic foundations of the whole Israelite community would be destroyed. So notice here that it's not the foreigners who were impacting Jerusalem at this time. They weren't the object of the lawsuit. It was the rich Jewish nobility that were taking advantage of the situation and exploiting the poor. So their economic gain was undermining and destabilising the economic stability in the Israelite nation. So they were putting the poor at a greater position of poverty, which is basically what their enemies wanted. So Israel's enemies, they were out to get them, of course, but it was actually the internal strife that was destroying Israel at this time. So the people they had borrowed from their own Jewish brothers. And Jews were not allowed to charge interest to each other. That was part of the law. They were allowed to charge interest to foreigners, but they weren't allowed to charge interest to their fellow Jews. They were allowed to take a pledge, they were allowed to take collateral, but they couldn't take possession of that collateral until the debt was paid. They could take possession of that collateral until the debt was paid. They could hold on to that until the debt was repaid. But here, the Jews they were being displaced from their fields, their farms, their homes, and so they couldn't repay the loan. They couldn't even work the asset of their land to increase income to repay the loan. So they were crippled again and again. So the problem wasn't just the interest or the usury, but it was that the rich Jews were demanding a pledge as well, so that the physical guarantee until that loan was paid, which meant the forfeiture of their property. So usury is the action of the practice of lending money at unreasonably high interest rates. And usury is the practice of making unethical or immoral monetary loans that unfairly enrich the lender. So the Jews loaning money to the Jews and charging unreasonable high interest rates was prohibited under the law. So you can see that in Exodus 22 verse 25, Leviticus 25 verse 36. It says that don't take advantage or don't take interest or any profit from them, but fear the Lord so that they may continue to live among the community. So the law was supposed to be gentle to those that had to borrow money so that they could continue to live among the community, and those poor people who were borrowing money could still be a blessing back to the community. So the law was supposed to protect rather than take advantage of the vulnerable. So the common people were being forced to use their ancestral land, even their homes, to secure these loans, and debtors were forced to use their children as payment for these creditors. So we ask ourselves, how could this happen? How could this happen in such a short time? It's only a matter of just a few weeks of this building project. But even today, we see the same type of economic oppression happening to the poor. And you can probably think of many examples as you look around in your local community where the rich are taking advantage of the poor. It doesn't take much for people to be tempted to take financial advantage of those that are vulnerable. Verse 6, when I heard their outcry of these charges, I was very angry. So Nehemiah, he was not just angry, he was very angry about this particular situation. He was particularly angry at the nobles and the officials' lack of compassion. Nehemiah became angry because these money problems were caused in part because of the greed of those that wanted to profit off the trouble of others, something that the law of Moses really prohibited. You see that in Exodus 22:25. Nehemiah became angry because these money problems led to a lack of unity among God's people, and this unity is more precious than any amount of money. Nehemiah became angry because these money problems stopped the work of the Lord of rebuilding the walls. They hadn't finished yet. They still had half the project to go. And it must have frustrated him that they could stand so strong against an enemy but fall so quickly with their own internal problems. Nehemiah knew that when Judah was conquered, many of the Jews were sold as slaves to foreigners, and many of them had been bought out of slavery by other Jews. And because of this, it was very wrong of the Jews to be sold into slavery to another Jew because they couldn't pay the high interest of the loan. So Nehemiah had compassion, he understood the problem, and he wanted to fix it. Verse 7, so I pondered them in my mind and Then accused the nobles and the officials. I told them, you are charging your own people interest. So I called them into a large meeting to deal with them, and I said, as far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles, and now you are selling your own people only for them to be sold back to us? They kept quiet because they could not find anything to say. Verse 9, so I continued, what you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of God and avoid the reproach of the Gentile enemies? And I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain. But let us stop charging interest. Give back to them immediately their fields, their vineyards, their olive groves and their houses, and also the interest that you are charging them. 1% of money, grain and new wine and olive oil. So verse 7, it says that Nehemiah pondered. He pondered them in their mind and accused the nobles and the officials. And this is a great leadership approach of Nehemiah. He was a man who was passionate enough to get angry, but wise enough not to act until he had considered the matter very carefully. He confronted the nobles and the officials for exploiting the poor. And Nehemiah reminds them that they were once Jews and that they are Jews and that they were once in slavery. And now after 70 years, they had been bought back to live freely in Jerusalem. And now they're enslaving their own people. And he emphasized that their actions were wrong. Nehemiah is enraged and he demands that they return their fields and their homes and the vineyards and the olive groves, because they had unjustly taken them from their fellow brothers and sisters. Verse 12, so the people respond, they say, we will give it back, they said, and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. And then I summoned the priests and made the nobles and the officials take an oath and do what they had promised. So Nehemiah, he wisely told the truth in love. So he's confronting his brothers and they receive his rebuke and they choose to do what is right and they admit that what they have done is wrong. So they're teachable. They have a spirit that allows correction. And I think that's kind of pretty impressive. They're open to admitting that they were wrong. And often in any country, in any era, too few people are willing to admit that they are wrong and then choose to do right to correct it, especially when money's involved. So they all agree to restore the property back to its rightful owners and promise not to take advantage of them again. And so Nehemiah wanted to keep the nobles accountable for their promise. Because it's one thing to say you're going to do something, it's one thing to be accountable and actually follow through on what you have promised to do. So the nobles have promised to give back the property and no longer charge interest. And so a record, which is what we read here, this is the record that made this to create public accountability. So this record of Nehemiah chapter 5 is written so that these nobles have public accountability for their promise. So Nehemiah wisely knew that their words weren't going to be enough. Something had to be written down and to enable or to encourage them to follow through on their action, and so that people would do according to what they had promised. Verse 13, I also shook out the folds of my robes and said, in this way God will shake out the houses and the possessions of anyone who does not keep his promise. So may such a person be shaken out and emptied. At this whole assembly, they said amen and they praised the Lord, and the people did what they had promised. So Nehemiah, he shook out his robes. It's a symbolic and a dramatic public oath to emphasize the seriousness of a broken promise. He used this physical act to declare that if anyone didn't keep their promise, they would have their possessions similarly shaken out and emptied by God. Verse 14, moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I had appointed to be governor of the land in Judah, until the 30th year, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate food allotted to the governor. But the earlier governors, those preceding me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition to food and wine. Their assistants also lorded it over the people, but out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. Instead, I devoted myself to the work on the wall, and all my men were assembled there for the work. We did not acquire any land. So Nehemiah's behaviour is very different to his predecessors. So the preceding governors, he acts very different to them. And he is an example of generosity. Nehemiah didn't exploit his position of authority. Nehemiah, in his own life, he lived the way the nobles and the rulers should live, to not take personal advantage of another person's need. He did what was every godly leader must do. He never expected more than his followers, than he expected for himself. So in contrast to Nehemiah, we see in the book of Judges what it looks like when leaders take advantage of the people and elevate themselves far above those that are leading. And an example of this we see as Gideon. So Gideon, after a battle, winning a battle, he requested a single gold earring from each of the soldiers in the army. So the soldiers had one, and they had collected the gold earrings from those that they were in battle with, and then the Israelite soldiers had to give one gold earring to Gideon. And so these donations, they elevated Gideon far above the average level of any of the people that he was leading. So Gideon went from being one of the lowest of the low to being a millionaire overnight. And Gideon, he couldn't handle this prestige, and eventually Gideon fell into idolatry, and he led others to do the same. So we see this in Judges 6, 7, and 8. And if you're interested in looking more about Gideon, I do have a video on Judges 6, 7, and 8, so you can look that up and watch them for yourself too. Verse 17, furthermore, 150 Jews and officials ate at my table, as well as those who came to us from the surrounding nations. Each day 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some poultry were prepared for me, and every 10 days an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. In spite of all this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor, because of the demands were heavy on the people. So Nehemiah, he hosted 150 Jews and rulers at his dining table every day. Nehemiah not only did not take what he could have taken, he also gave when he didn't have to. So he received a lot of food from the king's position, which he could have sold for his own profit, but instead he gave it away, and as an example of generosity, feeding as many as he could. So he fed 150 people regularly. So in spite of all these privileges and positions, Nehemiah never demanded the total amount of food allotted to the role of governor, because he didn't want to cripple the people. He could have taken more because it was a provision for the governor, and that was his position, but he chose not to. Therefore, Nehemiah was an example of, he was a good example because of what he didn't take. So similar to what we see in Paul in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 9 verses 10 to 12, in the same way, the Lord has commanded those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. But I, so Paul, he says, I have not used any of these rights. So Paul, like Nehemiah, he chose not to abuse and take advantage of those he was ministering to. Verse 19, remember me with favour, my God, for all I have done for these people. So Nehemiah, again, he wisely responds to confronting those who were doing wrong with prayer. We know that Nehemiah is a man of prayer. And his solution for the situation was to call upon the Lord. This prayer is an appropriate complement to his actions, because it's a humble appeal to God for his divine favour and a request for his glory to be displayed in Jerusalem at the time. So that's all I have for you from Nehemiah chapter 5. It's been a pleasure spending time with you again. And so I look forward to next time when I see you in Judges chapter 6. Bye.